welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2021. In this session, we're going to highlight the work of Verici, a company that specializes in kidney transplant testing at every stage of the patient journey. With me is Sara, Barrington, its CEO. Sara, welcome.
Thank you, Vivienne. Nice to meet you.
Can you start us off by explaining what typically happens to a patient prior to a kidney transplant? I mean, all of us are aware from movies and films that you have to have tissue matching. What does that involve?
It's an interesting process, Vivienne. You know, what we have is globally about 300,000 people waiting for a transplant, but only about 93,000 of those actually get a transplant every year. There is a certain amount of what we call matching of the organ to the recipient. But a lot of those factors are what we would call broad clinical factors and have been found to be, rather sort of low performing. And then once you have the organ transplanted, the clinician is really faced with managing care through the use of immunosuppressant drug therapies. Now, I don't know if you know anything about immunosuppressants, but they are very large drugs. They are suspending your entire, immune system. The biggest threat to an organ, obviously, usually very protective to the body. Now it's recognizing the organ as an alien being and can attack that organ. And so the clinician is giving a very large dose of the immunosuppressant therapy without any real knowledge on how that recipient is going to respond, how aggressive their immune system is going to be, and how well their body is going to be able to adopt and repair that that graft in the body. So they will recall, a feeling of operating in a world of really guesswork rather than clear diagnostic information. And that's where our diagnostics are very, very helpful. We are immediately directly measuring the immune system and its responses and the cell pathways through immunophenotyping, gene signatures, looking at the up and the down regulation. And we're being able to give the clinician some very clear information. Pre-transplant, how aggressive is that recipient's immune system likely to be, and therefore how to modulate that drug therapy. And then in the early stage of damage, what's actually happening to that organ. And later on, there's later stages as well. So our technology is using information from that immune system through the blood, through these gene signatures, to be very clearly trying to help that transplant journey.
And when was Verici set up and how did it come about?
It's actually out of technology out of Mount Sinai, Barbara Murphy's lab, and they've been working on this for a decade. They did a very extensive study called the GO-CAR study over about 350 multi-center, just to get some very firm performance metrics on this technology end to end. We licensed, in fact, it was Renalytix that first licensed it out of Mount Sinai. You may have heard of it as Fractal DX during that journey. That was spun out this year. We went public early November of 2020. And it is now obviously housed in its own company with its own management team, looking forward to really press ahead with its development.
So this is a growing market because not only, of course, there are many, many more people now with end-stage kidney disease, but you've also got a trend towards living kidney donation.
That's right. You see both in the US and in Europe, government directives that have been able to really influence the, first of all, the push towards living donors. That gives you a better chance of success, as you know, but also just the organ supply. There have been many inefficiencies, and we've seen, in fact, Europe was one of the first places to really make a push on that. And then I think it was 2013, they saw just in that year alone through government action, something like a 17% increase in the number of organs that were available. Obviously from us, we're not in the organ selection business. We're in making those organs that are made available to recipients more successful. And that in itself encourages living donors.
Now, you've mentioned your exciting year in 2020. Tell me what 2021 promises.
Yes, thank you. 2021 for us is doing a large-scale, multi-center clinical validation study. We're obviously taking the very high-performing metrics that we've got right now, and we're putting them through a very rigorous validation study. That's our last, if you like, step before commercialization. Our path is to go through, in the States, what we call a clear regulatory path. That's slightly easier than going through the FDA. The FDA at the moment, as you know, is all snarled up with COVID, and traditionally has been less interested in regulating the area of transplants. You'll see that all companies have really gone through this clear regulatory pathway. That enables us to do the testing in our labs. The complexity stays with us. The result goes back to the clinician. And from the bedside, it's a much easier process rather than having to rely on training hospital labs.
Will your trials be affected by COVID? Because, a lot of people who require kidney transplants are, by definition, pretty sick people who don't want to go near a hospital that's full of COVID patients. So are you going to be able to recruit to your trials successfully?
Obviously, that's a question we always have in the last year and this year. COVID has confounded a lot of clinical trials. A couple of mitigating factors for us. One, effectively, it's in a transplant center rather than in the general hospital. So that mitigates the risk to the patient in going into a general hospital and contracting there. Secondly, we've looked at being worldwide and picking off countries that may have a slightly different dynamic to the Northern Hemisphere. As we're looking at the winter surge through COVID, obviously we're looking for countries that may have already had that surge, maybe or in their summer. So that's another thing we can do. And we've also looked at, expanding the number of our centers so that if we have any that have to close down, then, obviously we've got others that are still recruiting. Beyond that, if the world has a big shutdown, there's not a lot you can do, but we're mitigating it as much as we can do.
Assuming everything goes well, when are you looking to find some results?
Yeah, and we're looking to finish the trial by the end of this year. We'll be publishing and going forward with our clear certification, and our commercial plans are to launch by mid to Q3 of 2022.
And what's the competition in this area?
Yeah, the competition in the area is very much focused on our second product. So if I can take a step back, our first product is what we call Clarava. It's a pre-transplant prognostic. And realistically, there's no competition in that area, Vivienne. What we have is these broad clinical factors and nothing much else. There's no real diagnostic test. And so those, we see that there's really very little competition. Competition is the standard of care right now. We know that clinicians are looking forward to having a diagnostic in that area. The other leading product that we have is a product called Tutiva. That is faced at what we call the early stage rejection, and that's usually around about 3 months. There are a number of companies that are dealing with that, but we have a very clear differential in our technology. They are focused on what we call cell-free DNA. I like to call it the debris in the blood, but it's essentially measuring something that's in the blood. It's not very specific. It can come from other areas of damage, and therefore what we're seeing is that it's not only after the event, but it can be sometimes misleading because of its general nature. So clinicians are, okay, well, you know, I get some information, but I'm looking for something more specific. Our test is directly measuring the immune response, what's happening in the organ right there. So first of all, it's real time. And then secondly, it's measuring what is happening before the damage is really done, at a point where for the clinician, it's very actionable. You know, we always talk about our performance on PPV, that's positive predictive value. Sorry, be good if I could get my terms straight. But this is something that's very actionable for the data, for the clinician, and that you know that something's happening and that they are justified in using these very large drugs quite aggressively if there's damage that's happening.
And of course, it's so critical because kidneys are such a precious resource. I mean, you know, such a precious resource, not in just in terms of numbers, but people may have waited for a very, very long time. And their health is deteriorating.
It's horrible. People can be on that waiting list for up to 10 years. And dialysis is no fun, as you know. You know, it's just not a good quality of life. And it's horrible for people to have to wait so long. You know, everything that we can do to improve the success and therefore the numbers of organs, absolutely vital.
And is this something that you are going to sell yourselves, or you're going to partner with somebody else?
I never say no to partnerships and collaborations, but my plan is realistically for us to do our commercial adoption ourselves. This is because a lot of the care is centered in transplant centers. There's about just over 220, I think, in the US. And roughly the same, 226 between 4 organizations in the EU. Very powerful, you know, access there. It's not like you need a very large general sales force. You are, you know, it's not, you know, going to the primary care physicians, which is always a difficult you know, sell for companies. They've got to have a lot of people on the street there. For us, it's much more a higher level where we're trying to get written into the protocol, where it's more of a kind of talk to the C-suite and the clinicians in a center to explain how our tests are really helping that end-to-end care and get adopted in that way. To me, this is much more of a business development team rather than a general sales force.
So what can investors look to it over the next 6 to 12 months as milestones?
Obviously, we are very focused on our clinical trial. You know, we are on track on that. You can look for first site live and then all sites on board, and then at the end that will be our you know, finished of the trial. That's what our plans are for this year.
And what about your cash runway?
Yeah, our cash runway, we have, very fortunately, we have enough for at least another 30 months. You know, that's something that we were very happy about. We aimed on this round to raise enough to get through effectively our development milestones, our clinical trials, our associations with, you know, and collaborations with other people to widen that portfolio, strengthen that portfolio. Very much a product, what I would say, very much product development set of milestones. Then obviously, you know, you do the regulatory path, and that's key to the tail end of transitioning from your product development into your commercial strategy. And obviously we start laying down the groundwork in reimbursement. At the point of first revenues, getting into our early adopters, at that point I say the company is now moving into a different set of milestones, the commercial milestones, and that's where we probably look to raise an additional round of funding for wider adoption.
So, Sara, a really needed product in a market that is growing all the time. Well, how do you look forward to 2021?
You know, I'd like to address your first point, you know, a little bit more expansively, because this idea that it's a very needed product is being really reflected in our advisors. and in the clinician enthusiasm. They're kind of impatient, really, which is lovely. These set of products have been the subjects of a lot of both academic and transplant focus from clinicians. There is a pent-up demand for it, and that's something that we're looking for in 2021 to be very focused on getting there and accelerating anything that we can to robustly get to a commercial reality, that something to meet this demand.
Sara, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I wish you every success because those patients certainly need it.
Thank you so much.